I'm Shannon Watkins, and I am here today with Donna Lopiano, president of the Drake Group. The Drake Group's mission is to defend academic integrity in higher education from the corrosive aspects of commercialized college sports. The Drake Group advocates for reforms in college sports in order to ensure that student athletes receive a quality college education. Donna, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Okay, so to start off, over the summer, a group of U.S. senators released a College Athletes Bill of Rights statement and promised future legislation enshrining athletes' rights. The Drake Group applauded the initiative. What specific legislative actions does the Drake Group hope that Congress will take?
The Drake Group has been around for about 20 years, and we were in the last year or so, we were in the midst of supporting a bill in the House, which would have established a 2-year congressional commission to examine the need for reform in intercollegiate athletics. Since that time, since that bill was filed by Representative Donna Lopiano from Florida, a lot has happened. COVID has happened. Significant racial protests have happened. I think the significant piece of the puzzle has been Senator Cory Booker has come off the campaign trail as a presidential candidate and is playing now a leadership role in asking for athletes' rights and bringing public attention to that. Senators, Murphy and Blumenthal from Connecticut have long asked for a real NCAA reform effort. And we've been there. The Drake Group has been with the senators and representatives, kind of trying to figure out what's the next step in reform, especially when we realize that the Congress has been dysfunctional with a Senate that is pretty much a do-nothing Senate. Adding to all of this, and I think a significant precipitating factor is the fact that there are 34 states now that have pending legislation or have already passed legislation that would give college athletes the right to exploit, to monetize their own names, images, and likenesses outside of, separate from their institutions of higher education, in direct contradiction to current NCAA rules, which are very onerous, that don't leave any room for college athletes to make money outside of school, very much unlike other students who, if I'm a performing arts major or I'm a musician, I can earn money and play a gig on the weekend in the local restaurant or bar. Athletes can't conduct a quarterback camp for 10 to 12-year-olds during the summer to teach them how to throw a football. So lots of things have happened, and the significance of the Athletes' Bill of Rights is, rather than Congress saying, well, we're going to need to study this for 2 years before we do anything, rather than Congress saying, let's do a very narrow bill on athletes' NIL rights, NIL, name, image, likeness rights. Congress doesn't pay attention very often to a subject. Why waste it on such a narrow subject like NIL? We know we need federal legislation on name, image, and likeness because you can't have chaos among the 34 states. But I think what has changed the game is Booker and Blumenthal, Murphy, 7 other senators saying, we're going to go after a lot more than that. There are many important issues here, not the least of which is athlete health and well-being, protection from athletic injury, economic exploitation of athletes, and educational exploitation of athletes. College athletes in the revenue-producing sports, most of whom are predominantly minority, predominantly Black, are being specially admitted into institutions, thrown into less demanding courses, and forced into academic majors that are less demanding. And as a result, they leave school without the school fulfilling the educational promise of a college degree. So all of those things are kind of lining up, the stars have lined up in a manner that suggests Congress may very well act in a big way on this issue, especially if we see a change in the current Senate blockade.
That sounds definitely promising. What other, you've mentioned several rights that the future hope for legislation would include. Are there any other additional protections that such a legislation would include?
Well, there's lots to, the Drake Group, when we saw the 2-page Athletes' Bill of Rights, what we're good at doing is taking concepts and saying, this is how intercollegiate athletics works. If you want to get this done, then this is how you should attack it. So that we submitted a 20, 30-page bill that would accomplish all of the things that were in the Senator's Athletes' Bill of Rights. Do we think all of that is going to get adopted lock, stock, and barrel? No. But at least it gives them a good blueprint of how to attack these things. So with regard to name, image, and likeness, the one thing, well, we have to remember that we're in the middle of an intersection between racial injustice, intercollegiate athletics, predominantly white, very selective higher education system. And in the middle of this is intercollegiate athletics, which prevents the athletes who are directly responsible for making billions of dollars in football and basketball, predominantly Black athletes. They've limited their economic possibilities, especially by unfairly limiting their outside employment. So this is an important piece of that legislation. And what this would say is, stay out of the athlete's business. They should get any job they want short of signing on the dotted line with the professional sports team. Or if you're an individual athlete, entering into a contest for prize money, pay for play. That's the only reason the NCAA should make them ineligible. And that everything else, they should be able to make money like anyone else. And if schools are worried about boosters inappropriately, siphoning money off to those athletes in quantities that are in excess of their fair market value or the services that they render, we can easily set up a third-party, independent, NIL commission that would set the rules, that would review the contract terms, that would protect the athletes, and that would ring the bell if there was inappropriate and either against NCAA rules or fraudulent involvement of people trying to take advantage of these kids. So we think there are solutions to NILs. We think we should avoid the athlete and the institution getting into business together. Because if I were an individual and I were employed by college or university, I could not use the name of my university for private gain. That would be against the law. And it would also be against the institution receives the tax-exempt status because of its mission, which is to educate kids. It doesn't receive a tax-exempt status for being a professional sports business or for engaging in a business like video game companies that will combine the school and an athlete and offer video games. So we think that mechanism, licensing fees through group efforts, joint efforts between schools and athletes, should not fly, because they would be further exploitation of the school taking advantage of the athlete, because who gets half the money, right? Except we think that would be a great idea if 100% of those revenues, both on the athlete side and the institution side, went into a national medical trust fund that would provide long-term athlete disability insurance for athletes, and a fund that would be there 10 to 20 years from now, when a lot of these football players are going to be suffering from Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or dementia, early onset dementia, God forbid CTE. We know that head trauma is a serious problem in many sports, and yet there is no fund to do that like there is for the NFL. NFL has set aside $1 billion to protect some probably 13 or 14,000 former football players. That's the number of kids that play every year, that play every year in Division I football. In fact, not even Division I football, that's just the FBS in 10 conferences. And there's no fund, there's no set aside by the NCAA, there's no set aside by the institutions. They take that cash and they give it to 7, 8 figure coaching salaries, or they build lavish facilities, but they're not saving it or worrying about the health and well-being of kids. So we think that's a really necessary purpose. It would be difficult for anybody to set up a funding source for that. So we think that this joint arrangement by the institution and the kid to both contribute is a good deal. We also think that that fund should be subsidized by institutional rights fees, television rights fees, which are considerable. And if you take a little bit from every rights agreement, that can build the fund. And we also think that there has to be a commitment on the part of institutions to start paying the insurance bills and the medical expenses of intercollegiate athletes. Most people don't realize that in order to try out for a team, the school says to the athlete, you either have to buy your student insurance on campus, or we have to use your parents' policy. Schools aren't buying primary insurance. What the schools are doing is making out like bandits, because the student brings the primary insurance. The school takes out a cheap secondary insurance policy. And those policies don't stop being applicable 2 years after you leave school. So any of this, if your knees have to be replaced 10 years from now, if you're suffering from dementia 15 years from now, there is no source to help these athletes, even though we know that that's part of their future. So in this way, we're dealing with NILs in a way where the athlete is free to make as much as he wants. If he wants to get in cahoots with the institution can keep its tax-exempt purpose and use this money to take care of the health and well-being of athletes. And that, that kind of, can work out. The other two big pieces are one I've touched on. We need to make sure that athletes' medical care is a given. The institution provides the basic policy. The institution guarantees all medical expenses associated with athletic injury, and that this be a firm promise. We also think this is an opportunity to remove or to change the power differential between the coach and the athlete. Right now, everyone's aware that athletes suffer abuse at the hands of coaches. It may be verbal abuse, it may be emotional abuse, it may be coaches telling athletes as a form of punishment, you have to run 100 stadium steps or 20 laps, or using exercise as punishment. And that's dangerous for athletes. So the athlete won't speak up because of the power differential between the coach and the athlete. The athlete knows that if they complain against a coach, the coach can take their scholarship away because these are all one-year agreements. The coach can take their starting position away, can sit them on the bench as punishment. There are many different ways that coaches can take retaliatory action against athletes. That's why they don't speak up to protect themselves. So we're proposing that key part of this legislation be a firm 5-year commitment to athletic scholarships, which removes the fear of the scholarship being revoked. It doesn't stop, the starting position fear or anything like that, but it's a start. We also think there has to be a mechanism to an independent agency to complain in those situations to protect the athlete more so than now. We also think that the athletes have to be much more involved in the governance of intercollegiate athletics and should have 30% of all the board of director seats on the NCAA, for instance. Not that the athletes themselves should serve. They're young, they're inexperienced, they're full-time students, right? But they should select someone to represent them that was an athlete and now 10, 20 years down the road is a high-powered attorney or somebody who's really a powerful force. Put LeBron James on the NCAA board of directors. That would change the power imbalance. And so we're doing those kinds of things, trying to figure out how Congress can demand that these things happen in intercollegiate athletics. And the carrot that Congress has, that's humongous, is that every year $130 billion is given by the federal government under the Higher Education Act to colleges and universities to support student attendance. So it's student tuition money, it's Pell Grants, this fuel that is used to fund athletic programs, because there are only 29 programs in the country that are making more money than they spend. That carrot's a big carrot. So if Congress says, if you don't do this, you don't get this money, that's a big deal.
No, it is, certainly. In the event that Congress doesn't act, is there anything that states can do?
Well, I think we're seeing states now, those 34 states that have enacted NIL rules. There are many of those states who have also inserted other provisions in addition to employment rights, but they're all over the place. Some of them have the establishment of an academic trust for athletes who don't graduate but want to return to school later. But they're very, very, very different. 34 states, 34 different provisions, which is why Congress should step in. And Congress has the advantage of, a 30,000-foot view, the wherewithal to study and not react, too quickly. These are tough issues that have to be thought out. So Congress is probably in the best position to do it. If Congress doesn't act, it's a good question, then the states could. Then you run into real dilemmas, because let's say the most liberal state, the one who allows the athletes to make the most money, who has the most protections, let's say California says every athlete gets 5-year scholarships. Then athletes will go to California schools, and then everybody else goes crazy, right? They have a recruiting advantage. So you can try to let that system play out and see what happens, whether everybody ups the ante to benefit the athletes. But it'll be mass mayhem for, what is an interstate commerce business. Athletes play each other across state lines all the time. So do you have to go through that chaos?
Interesting. How has the NCAA failed to protect college athletes?
The NCAA was started in 1906 because athletes were dying playing college football. They were originally, then President Roosevelt pretty much said to the NCAA, I'm going to ban college football unless you get your act straight and start governing this sport. And that was the origin of the NCAA. It was an athlete protection response to this concern. The NCAA is nowhere near protecting student athletes' education, student athletes' health and well-being. They've become a trade association protecting the money-making ability of their member institutions, keeping athletes as minimum wage employees. It's your scholarship only. You can't work outside. You're limited as to how much your scholarship money will cover. So they've been in the business of controlling athletes for the benefit of the institution, as opposed to protecting athletes from the institution. They go into court when the NCAA gets sued for concussion, for instance. The NCAA says, we're not responsible for athlete health. It's them. It's our members. So they throw their member institutions under the bus. But the NCAA today can pass a rule that says all of our member institutions, as a condition of being a member of this association, you have to adopt these 30 consensus medical statements, which will protect athletes from everything from heat-related illness to concussion to sickle cell syndrome. The NCAA adopts none of this. So they've been AWOL when it comes to protecting athletes, and Congress knows it. Congress has little respect for the NCAA.
Okay, so let's talk about how the coronavirus has affected college sports. Colleges and college sports organizations such as the Big Ten have decided to resume practices and games this fall, despite concerns about the virus. For example, UNC Chapel Hill has moved all of its classes online, but it's still playing football. What do you think of these decisions?
Higher education has lost its mind. The whole notion of bringing kids back to campus, students in general, is a financial decision, not a health decision. We know that we don't have a vaccine. We don't have good therapeutics. We don't have testing that is 15-minute turnaround testing. We know all this, and why are we bringing college athletes back? Why are we bringing college students back when we know what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to do the orientation party. They're going to engage in group activity. These are 1 year above 17-year-olds, right? Remember when you were 17? Sorry, this is, higher education has lost its mind. And it's worried about its economic status. Kids aren't going to be willing to pay tuition if they don't have in-person classes, if they aren't participating in the culture of the institution. And athletics is even worse off, because athletics is beholden to the television monster, right? $50 to $100 million a year in lost media revenues for the top 100 schools in this country, right? And they're looking at, they haven't put any money aside. They haven't, there's no insurance for this pandemic. They are beside themselves. So what are they doing? They're willing to sacrifice their athletes for that 50 to 60 million that they're going to lose this year. And it's that simple. Because there's no way we can protect these athletes. There's no way we can protect a student body that we can't control. The professional sport analogies right now are not analogies, because as a professional athlete, I can enter into an agreement with the Players Association, and it's a contract, and I can cloister those people in one place for 3 months if I have to, and make them not party. Not so with college kids. And so it's very disingenuous, I think, for athletic departments to bring their kids back with promises to parents, and we have our best scientists who tell us we can do this safely. Garbage. Without testing, you can't do anything safely unless you put a bubble around each kid, and nobody can do it. Nobody can do it. So I expect ups and downs this fall in terms of students are going to go on and off from in-person classes. Athletics contests are going to go in and out, canceled, and it's mind-boggling to me. If I were a parent, I would be really distressed that the Big Ten parents were insisting that their kids, go back and play college football is an anathema to me. It's an example of parents living through, the dreams and aspirations of their children who they'd love to be pro athletes and not miss out on the draft, whose identity is part of, my daughter's on scholarship at so and so. And it's sad when you think of the motivation behind that, instead of parents saying, I'm glad you're being safe with the health of my child.
Well, so in North Carolina, the State Secretary of Health and Human Services denied a request for North Carolina colleges to allow families to attend games. So based on your last answer, do you think that's prudent?
Absolutely. Just think of just think of a game, just think of the games that were on this past weekend, right? And that let some kids in, and who said, oh, everybody's going to be 6 feet from each other. And then the television camera swings to the end zone and sees a packed end zone, all a student section, right on top of each other, with not everybody wearing masks. It's Trumpian in its audacity. Like I said, I'm speechless with anyone trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the general public in terms of the deadliness of this virus and the fact that we can't protect anyone from it, and we have to be really, really cautious. They're willing to gamble with the lives of kids for reasons that are questionable. We know kids are spreaders. We know athletes are in danger of a syndrome, a heart inflammation syndrome. And what they say is, oh, we won't let them back playing for 35 days. Come on. Like I said, I don't get it.
Well, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier about brain injuries, but I just want to ask a slightly more specific question on that topic. So we've learned a lot over the past 10 years and learning about how dangerous football can be for the brain. Do you think, aside from putting funds together, which is also a great idea, do you think we'll see changes to football as more research about concussions and long-term brain health come about?
We know how to make football safer. The colleges and universities aren't willing to adopt those rules now. The Ivy League has really, led us in that the Ivy League is a conference which doesn't even allow its football teams to attend postseason play, right? Has made rules changes. It is said, sorry, no contact at all allowed in practice, right? That's not hard. That's player-to-player contact. So you can use the tackling dummy. You can use this. Do you have to suffer brain trauma in practice? It's repetitive brain hits, not concussive brain hits that result in CTE or long-term dementia, Parkinson's, or whatever. It isn't somebody knocking you out. It isn't the one blow. It's repetitive hits. So whatever we can do to minimize that. We know that we don't have to have kickoffs at the 40 or the 35. You've eliminated a kickoff if you wanted to. Why are we keeping a portion of the game in which you let players build up speed over 50 yards to see how hard I can hit the receiver of a punt or a kickoff? Why would it change the game terribly to forbid that? So there are lots of things that we can do to make the game safer, but we're stuck with this, tough guy, anachronistic, the fans aren't going to be there if we change college football. I doubt that. I doubt it. So I think we have a long way to go to make football safer, and to make collision sports safer. There is no reason why ice hockey has to be a collision sport to the extent that it is right now, where you just take off and try to kill somebody next to the boards. Women's ice hockey doesn't even allow it. It's a game of skill. It's a game of skating. It's a game that this is how games are supposed to be won, not by harming your opponent, but by being more skilled than your opponent. So as soon as you introduce physical assault and harm into any game, you eliminate skill. It is, like I said, it's nonsensical. Why do we do it? It's the tough guy mentality, and we shouldn't want to do it. We shouldn't be allowing, kids under the age of 14 to engage in tackle football. They can play, flag until they're 14. It's not going to hurt them. They'll be great passers. They'll be great runners. So we have a long way to go. Think of lacrosse. Why in lacrosse can, in men's lacrosse, they can take this stick and bang it on the opponent, right? And they don't allow that at all in women's lacrosse. Why do I have to take my stick and hit somebody else with it? When you think of it in that sense, you have to say, are we, in the caveman days? Or do we have some sense of what this is all about as we know more from science?
Wonderful. Well, those are all my questions. Thank you so much, Donna, for speaking with me today. I know our readers and viewers will find your answers very, very interesting and informative. So I really appreciate it.
Okay. Nice meeting you, Shannon.